Have you ever felt like someone was watching you from the shadows? In today's video, we dive into 4 chilling tales where everyday places, churches, parks, and quiet neighborhoods become the setting for dark secrets and terrifying encounters. From a twisted stranger at mass to a church stalker with sinister intentions, these stories will keep you on edge until the very end. So, where are you watching from, and what time is it? Drop a comment below and let us know, and prepare yourself for some unforgettable scares. Lost in the Church of Fear. The sun was beginning to set as Benson, Justin, and I realized just how lost we were. What started as a casual hike through the rural countryside had turned into a frustrating and confusing journey through a maze of overgrown paths and dense woods. Our phones had no signal, and the once clear trail had long since disappeared, swallowed by the thick underbrush. We had been walking for hours, hoping to stumble upon a recognizable landmark or a main road. But with each step, the forest around us seemed to grow darker, the trees looming overhead, their branches clawing at the sky like skeletal fingers. The air was thick with the smell of earth and damp leaves, and the only sound was the crunch of our boots against the ground. Benson was the first to spot it, a small clearing up ahead, bathed in the last light of the setting sun. As we pushed through the thicket, we found ourselves standing in front of an old, weathered church. It was a strange sight, this forgotten building in the middle of nowhere. The wooden structure was dilapidated, its roof sagging, and its windows cracked, but the cross still stood tall on top of the steeple, casting a long shadow across the clearing. Justin and I exchanged uneasy glances, but Benson, always the adventurous one, shrugged and made his way toward the entrance. We followed hesitantly, feeling a chill creep up our spines as we approached the heavy wooden doors. Something about the church felt wrong, but we had no other options. Maybe someone inside could give us directions or help us find our way back to the main road. The door creaked loudly as Benson pushed it open, the sound echoing through the empty clearing. Inside, the church was dimly lit by a few flickering candles scattered across the altar. The air was cold, and the faint smell of mildew clung to the walls. As we stepped inside, our footsteps echoed unnaturally loud in the silence. At first, we didn't see anyone. The pews were empty, and the place looked like it hadn't been used in years. But then, out of the shadows, figures began to emerge. There were people, at least a dozen, sitting in the pews, their faces gaunt and pale, their clothes tattered and dirty. They stared at us with hollow eyes, their expressions unreadable but filled with a sense of hostility that made my skin crawl. We stood frozen for a moment, unsure of what to do. The people didn't speak, didn't move, but their eyes never left us. There was something deeply unsettling about the way they watched us, as if they were waiting for something. Benson, who had been so eager to explore, suddenly looked uneasy. The atmosphere in the church was thick with tension, and it became clear that we weren't welcome. Without a word, we turned and quickly made our way back toward the door. As we stepped outside, the cold evening air hit us like a slap, and for the first time since entering the church, I felt like I could breathe again. But the feeling of unease didn't leave us. Something was wrong with that place, and the way those people had looked at us, it felt like they knew something we didn't. As we walked away, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. We moved quickly, eager to put as much distance between us and that eerie church as possible. The path leading away from the clearing was barely visible in the fading light, and the trees seemed to close in around us, their branches rustling in the wind. None of us spoke as we hurried down the narrow trail, but the tension in the air was palpable. The strange, hostile stares of the people in the church lingered in my mind, filling me with a deep sense of unease. It wasn't until we had walked for several minutes that Justin broke the silence, his voice low and uneasy. Did anyone else notice how wrong that place felt? Benson nodded, glancing nervously over his shoulder. Yeah, those people didn't look right. Something was off about them. I didn't need to say anything. We all felt it, the cold, unsettling presence that seemed to cling to us even after we left the church. There was no denying it now. Something was very wrong with that place. As we continued down the path, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being followed. The hair on the back of my neck stood on end, and every time I looked back, I swore I saw movement in the shadows, something just out of sight, watching us. I kept telling myself it was just my imagination, but the further we walked, the stronger the feeling grew. Finally, after what felt like hours of walking in the dark, Benson stopped abruptly. "Do you hear that?" he whispered, his eyes wide with fear. We stood still, listening. At first, there was nothing but the sound of the wind rustling through the trees. But then, faintly, I heard it, footsteps. Slow, deliberate footsteps, coming from behind us. Panic gripped me as I turned to look, and that's when I saw them. Several figures, standing just beyond the edge of the trees, barely visible in the darkness. They were the same men we had seen in the church, their hollow eyes staring at us from the shadows. They didn't move, just stood there, watching us with the same eerie intensity they had in the church. My heart raced, and I could feel the panic rising in my chest. "We need to go. Now." Without another word, we took off down the path, running as fast as we could. The footsteps behind us grew louder, and I didn't dare look back to see if the men were following. My only focus was on getting as far away from that place as possible. The trees blurred around us as we ran, the branches whipping against our arms and legs, but the sound of the footsteps didn't stop. They were getting closer, the steady rhythm of their steps echoing in my ears. My breath came in ragged gasps, my legs burning with the effort, but I didn't stop. None of us did. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, we reached the edge of the woods. The trees parted, revealing a small gravel road that cut through the countryside. Relief washed over me as we stumbled onto the road, gasping for breath. We had escaped the woods, but I couldn't shake the feeling that the danger wasn't over yet. As we caught our breath, I glanced back toward the path we had come from. The men were gone, but the oppressive sense of dread remained. It felt like they were still watching us, hidden just out of sight, waiting for their next move. The small gravel road stretched ahead of us, winding through the dark countryside with no sign of civilization in sight. We were still shaken, our nerves on edge from the bizarre encounter in the woods. The cold air stung our faces as we walked in silence, each of us lost in our thoughts, trying to make sense of what had just happened. After what felt like an hour, we finally spotted a dim light in the distance, a small gas station, barely visible in the night. Relief flooded over me. We weren't sure how far we had wandered, but this was the first sign of life we'd seen since leaving the church. Maybe, finally, we could get some help. As we approached, the gas station looked old and run down, its flickering neon sign casting an eerie glow over the empty lot. A single pump stood in front of the station, and through the dirty windows, we could see the faint outline of a man sitting behind the counter. There was something unsettling about the place, but after everything we had been through, we didn't care. We needed help, and this was our only option. Benson was the first to push open the door, the bell above it jingling weakly as we stepped inside. The man behind the counter looked up, his eyes dull and tired, as if he hadn't had a customer in hours, maybe even days. He was older, his face lined with wrinkles, and he wore a stained flannel shirt that looked like it hadn't been washed in weeks. We got lost," Benson stammered, his voice still shaky from our ordeal. "We need directions." The man stared at us for a long moment, his expression unreadable. There was something off about him, something in the way he watched us with those cold, lifeless eyes. But then he nodded slowly and pointed to a map on the wall. "You're far off the main road," he muttered, his voice raspy. "You'll want to head north about 5 miles. That'll take you back to the highway." We thanked him quickly, eager to leave, but as we turned to go, I couldn't shake the feeling that the man knew more than he was letting on. There was a strange look in his eyes, something that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand on end. It was almost as if he knew exactly what we had seen back in the woods. As we walked out of the gas station, the man's gaze followed us, and for a brief moment, I thought I saw a faint smile curl at the corners of his lips. It was unsettling, to say the least. Once we were outside, Justin broke the silence. "Did anyone else think that guy was weird?" We all nodded in agreement. The gas station might have been our lifeline, but it didn't feel like a safe haven. In fact, the whole place felt wrong, just like the church had. We began walking down the road, the gas station's flickering lights fading behind us. The feeling of being watched hadn't left. If anything, it had only grown stronger. The road stretched out before us, and the night seemed darker than ever. As we walked, I glanced back over my shoulder, half expecting to see the men from the church, or worse, the strange gas station attendant, following us. But the road behind us was empty, silent. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching from the shadows. The road ahead seemed endless, and the sense of dread that clung to us was growing heavier with each step. Even though we had left the gas station behind, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were still being followed, watched by something just out of sight. Benson, Justin, and I walked in silence, too afraid to voice the fear gnawing at each of us. After walking for what felt like an eternity, the trees began to thin out, and the faint hum of distant traffic reached our ears. Relief washed over us as we realized we were finally approaching the highway. The darkness that had enveloped us for hours seemed to lighten, but the unease never left. Benson kept checking over his shoulder, his face pale and tense. "Do you think we lost them?" he asked quietly, his voice barely above a whisper. None of us answered right away, but we all knew what he was referring to: the men from the church, the strange gas station attendant, the overwhelming sense of danger that seemed to cling to us. I wanted to believe we had escaped, but the fear that had settled in my gut told me otherwise. Something wasn't right, and I could feel it in my bones. As we neared the highway, the distant glow of headlights appeared on the horizon, a beacon of safety after our terrifying journey. But just as we were about to step onto the asphalt, Justin froze, his eyes wide with fear. "Look," he whispered, pointing back toward the woods. I followed his gaze, and my heart dropped into my stomach. Standing at the edge of the trees, just beyond the reach of the headlights, were the men from the church. They stood motionless, watching us with the same cold, hostile eyes that had unnerved us from the start. There was no mistaking them now. They had followed us, tracking our every move since we left the church. Benson swore under his breath, his hands shaking. "We need to go. Now." Without hesitation, we bolted toward the highway, our footsteps pounding against the gravel as we ran. The sound of the approaching cars grew louder, but so did the sense of danger. I didn't dare look back again, too afraid of what I might see. Finally, we reached the road, the bright lights of passing cars illuminating our path. For the first time that night, I felt a sliver of hope. We had made it, escaped whatever had been stalking us. But as we stood by the side of the highway, panting and trying to catch our breath, a familiar figure emerged from the shadows. The man from the gas station. He stood just a few feet away, his face twisted into a knowing smile. There was something deeply wrong with him, something that made my skin crawl. It was as if he had known all along where we were going, like he had been guiding us into some twisted game we couldn't understand. "Thought you boys might need some more directions," he said, his voice dripping with malice. We didn't wait for him to say anything else. Benson flagged down the next car, and we scrambled inside, our hearts racing as the driver sped off down the highway. None of us spoke as the car carried us away, leaving the strange man and the haunted woods behind. But as I looked out the back window, I could still see the outline of the gas station man, standing on the side of the road, watching us with that eerie smile. We had escaped, but the fear lingered. Whatever we had encountered out there, it wasn't over. And deep down, I knew it never would be. What took the Ouija board? It started as a dare, the kind of thing that seems like a fun idea when you're young and looking for a thrill. Jack, Theo, and Michael had heard the stories about the old church on the edge of town, a crumbling relic of a place long forgotten, abandoned for decades. Rumors swirled that it was haunted, that strange things had happened there over the years. For most people, those rumors were enough to keep them away. But for the three friends, it was the perfect setting for a late-night adventure. Armed with a Ouija board that Theo had borrowed from his older sister, they set off for the church just after midnight. The night was cold, the sky overcast, and the only light came from their flashlights as they made their way through the overgrown path leading to the church. The building stood in the shadows, its once grand structure now decaying, with broken windows and ivy crawling up its stone walls. The heavy wooden doors creaked loudly as they pushed them open, the sound echoing through the empty nave. Inside, the church was eerily silent, the air thick with the smell of damp wood and dust. Broken pews were scattered across the floor, and the altar, once the focal point of the building, was now draped in shadows. Jack set the Ouija board on the floor near the altar, while Theo and Michael sat down on either side of him, their flashlights casting long shadows across the crumbling stone walls. The air inside the church felt heavier than outside, almost oppressive, but none of them mentioned it. Jack placed his fingers lightly on the planchette, and after a brief hesitation, the others followed suit. For a moment, they sat in silence, waiting for something to happen, though none of them really expected it to. The Ouija board was just a game, after all, something to scare themselves with before heading home. But as soon as Jack asked the first question, the atmosphere shifted. "Is there anyone here with us?" At first, nothing happened. The silence hung heavy in the air, and the faint sound of wind outside seemed distant. But then, slowly, the planchette began to move, gliding across the board with a soft scraping sound. Theo let out a nervous laugh, assuming one of them was messing around, but the look on Michael's face told a different story. No one was moving the planchette. The pointer slid to yes, and all three of them stared at the board, their hearts racing. The tension in the air grew thicker as Jack asked the next question, his voice shaky now. "Who are you?" Again, the planchette began to move, spelling out the letters one by one, but before they could make sense of the answer, a loud crack echoed through the church. The sound was deafening, like wood splintering, and it came from the direction of the altar. All three of them jumped to their feet, their flashlights darting toward the source of the noise. But there was nothing there. The altar stood in the shadows, untouched, but the air had changed. It was colder now, and the sense of being watched, of something unseen lurking in the darkness, was overwhelming. Before they could react, a small stone flew from the shadows and landed directly on the Ouija board with a sharp thud, sending the planchette spinning off the board. Panic surged through the group, and without a word, they bolted for the door, their hearts pounding in their chests. They didn't stop running until they were far from the church, the shadows of the night swallowing it behind them. The three friends didn't stop running until they reached the edge of town, gasping for breath, their faces pale and slick with sweat. None of them spoke for a long time, each too rattled by what had just happened to make sense of it. Jack was the first to break the silence, his voice shaking as he spoke. What was that?" The others had no answer, only haunted expressions to offer in return. The memory of the church felt like a weight on all of them, the cold air, the cracking sound from the altar, and the stone that had seemingly come from nowhere, landing perfectly on the Ouija board. It wasn't just a game anymore. Something had been there with them, something none of them could explain. The rest of the night was a blur. They didn't talk much on the way back to Jack's house, where they had planned to stay for the night. But no one slept. The feeling of dread clung to them like a cold mist, and even though they were far from the church, it felt like the darkness had followed them. Jack lay awake, staring at the ceiling, replaying the night's events in his mind. The sound of wood cracking still echoed in his ears, and every time he closed his eyes, he saw the Ouija board, the planchette moving on its own, and the stone hitting the board with an eerie finality. Something had happened in that church, something they couldn't explain, and something that felt far from over. Theo and Michael were just as shaken. Theo, always the skeptic, was unusually quiet, his normal bravado gone. He had been the one to bring the Ouija board, confident it was nothing more than a silly game, but now even he couldn't deny that something real had happened. Michael, who had been the most excited about the night's adventure, seemed completely drained, his face pale and his eyes wide with fear. At some point, exhaustion overtook them, and they drifted into an uneasy sleep, haunted by strange dreams filled with shadows and whispers. Jack woke up several times throughout the night, his heart racing, convinced he had heard footsteps outside his window, but each time, the house was silent. By morning, the fear had settled into a cold unease. None of them wanted to talk about what had happened, but the Ouija board was still on their minds. It had been left behind in the church when they fled, abandoned in their rush to get out. And as much as they wanted to forget about it, the thought of leaving it there, of whatever they had disturbed still lingering over it, was too unsettling to ignore. "We have to go back," Jack said finally, breaking the silence at breakfast. Theo and Michael exchanged uneasy glances, but they both knew he was right. The Ouija board couldn't stay there, not after what had happened. It didn't feel right to leave it behind in that place, as if it might stir up something even worse if they didn't retrieve it. Reluctantly, they agreed to return to the church later that afternoon. It was a decision made out of necessity, but none of them felt good about it. The weight of the night before still hung over them, and the thought of stepping foot in that church again filled them all with dread. As they prepared to go back, none of them could shake the feeling that whatever had happened the night before wasn't finished. The church had felt alive with something dark and old, and they had only scratched the surface. The afternoon sun was low in the sky as Jack, Theo, and Michael made their way back to the church, the sense of dread growing heavier with each step. The once adventurous excitement that had driven them the night before was gone, replaced by a deep, unsettling fear. No one wanted to return, but the Ouija board had to be retrieved. Leaving it behind felt like leaving a door open to something they didn't fully understand, and didn't want to. The path to the church seemed even more foreboding in the light of day. The trees cast long shadows, and the old building loomed ahead, its broken windows dark and lifeless. As they approached, none of them could shake the feeling that they were being watched, as though the church itself was waiting for them to return. When they reached the front steps, Jack hesitated. His stomach churned with anxiety, and his palms were slick with sweat. Theo and Michael stood beside him, their faces pale, eyes fixed on the doors. It had been hours since they fled, but the memory of the stone hitting the board, the sound of wood cracking, and the cold, eerie atmosphere inside still felt fresh. Jack pushed the door open slowly, and it creaked loudly in the stillness. Inside, the church looked exactly as it had the night before, silent, dark, and abandoned. But there was something different about it now. The air was thicker, the shadows deeper, and the feeling of being watched was almost unbearable. As they stepped inside, their footsteps echoed unnaturally loud against the stone floor. The altar loomed ahead, bathed in shadows, and the spot where they had left the Ouija board was clearly visible. But the board was gone. Jack's heart skipped a beat. He had been prepared for many things, strange noises, cold air, maybe even another encounter with whatever had disturbed them the night before, but not this. The board was simply gone, as if it had never been there at all. Theo let out a shaky breath, his voice barely above a whisper. "Where is it?" Michael, who had been scanning the room with wide eyes, shook his head in disbelief. There was no sign of the board, no trace of their game from the night before. The planchette, the board itself, everything was missing. A cold, creeping fear settled over them. The idea that someone, or something, had taken the board was more terrifying than anything they had imagined. It meant that whatever they had summoned, whatever they had disturbed, was still here. Watching. Waiting. Jack stepped closer to the altar, his flashlight sweeping over the floor, searching for any sign of the board. But there was nothing, no marks, no dust disturbed, no explanation. The church was empty, but the sense of danger was palpable. The silence pressed in on them, thick and suffocating. Just as Jack was about to suggest they leave, a sound echoed through the church. It was soft at first, a faint scraping noise that sent chills down his spine. The others heard it too, and they froze, their eyes wide with fear. The sound grew louder, coming from behind the altar, as though something, or someone, was moving in the shadows. Panic gripped them, and before any of them could react, the noise stopped abruptly. The silence that followed was deafening, more terrifying than the sound itself. Without another word, the three friends bolted for the door, their fear propelling them out of the church and into the fading daylight. They didn't stop running until they were far from the church, the building disappearing into the distance behind them. But the fear lingered. The Ouija board was gone, and whatever had taken it wasn't finished with them yet. The sun was setting as Jack, Theo, and Michael reached the edge of town, their breaths coming in ragged gasps from the frantic run. The church was far behind them now, but the fear and confusion followed like a shadow. They hadn't spoken since leaving the building, each too consumed by the terror of what had just happened. The disappearance of the Ouija board and the strange sounds in the church had left them with more questions than answers, and a growing sense of dread that something was still watching them. Jack glanced over his shoulder, half expecting to see the dark outline of the church looming in the distance, or worse, something following them. But the road behind them was empty, save for the darkening sky and the faint silhouette of trees. Still, he couldn't shake the feeling that the church had let them go too easily, that whatever they had disturbed wasn't finished with them yet. Back at Jack's house, the mood was tense. The friends sat in the living room, the weight of the evening pressing down on them. Theo, always the skeptic, was unusually quiet, his fingers tapping nervously against his knee. Michael, who had been the most shaken by the strange events in the church, stared blankly at the floor, his face pale and drawn. "We should have never gone there," Michael muttered finally, breaking the heavy silence. That place, it wasn't just abandoned. Something was there. Theo nodded reluctantly, his usual confidence shaken. "But where's the board?" he asked, more to himself than to anyone else. "It just vanished." The thought chilled them. The Ouija board disappearing without a trace felt wrong, as if it had been claimed by something in the church, something unseen but very much aware of their presence. The night replayed in Jack's mind, the sounds from the altar, the cracking wood, the stone that had fallen out of nowhere. None of it made sense, and yet, every part of it felt real. As the night wore on, Jack found it impossible to shake the feeling that they hadn't escaped. His house, normally a place of comfort, felt oppressive, like the air was thicker than it should be. The shadows seemed deeper, the silence more ominous. Even when they weren't speaking, he felt like someone, or something, was listening. That night, Jack lay awake, staring at the ceiling. Every creak of the house, every whisper of wind outside made his heart race. The events of the church had imprinted themselves on him, leaving a lingering fear that gnawed at the edges of his mind. As his eyes began to droop with exhaustion, a faint sound reached his ears, soft, almost imperceptible, but there. It was a scraping sound, like something being dragged slowly across wood. Jack's blood ran cold. He sat up in bed, heart pounding, straining to hear it again. The house was silent. But as he lay back down, he couldn't shake the memory of that same sound from the church, the noise that had signaled something moving in the shadows. The following day, none of them spoke about going back to the church. It was as if they had made an unspoken agreement to leave that place behind, to never mention the Ouija board again. But deep down, Jack knew that they hadn't left it behind. Whatever had taken the board, whatever had been watching them from the shadows, wasn't finished. And as the days passed, the faint sounds at night, the creaks, the whispers, the soft scraping, only grew louder. Hunted after the sinister mass. Emily and Marcus had been driving through rural Georgia for hours, enjoying the scenic beauty of the countryside. The winding roads and endless fields were a peaceful escape from the city, and they had no particular destination in mind. It was one of those trips meant to clear their heads and give them time to breathe. The landscape was dotted with old barns, dilapidated houses, and the occasional small church tucked away in the trees. It was one of those churches that caught Emily's eye. As they rounded a bend, the old white building came into view. It was tucked away at the end of a dirt road, its steeple standing tall against the backdrop of thick trees. A small, faded sign out front read St. Elijah's Church, though the lettering was worn and difficult to read. Curiosity got the better of them. "Let's check it out," Emily said, her interest piqued by the old structure. It looked like it had been there for decades, the kind of place that held history and secrets. Marcus hesitated but agreed. They had time to kill, and besides, it wasn't often they stumbled upon something like this. As they approached the church, they noticed that the parking lot had a few vehicles in it. A dusty van, a couple of older model cars. It seemed odd, given how remote the place was. From inside the church, faint music and chanting drifted out through the cracked wooden doors. It sounded like a service was underway. Emily and Marcus exchanged glances, unsure of whether to interrupt, but the atmosphere was strangely compelling. They pushed the door open cautiously, stepping inside. The interior of the church was dimly lit by candles, and the air was thick with the smell of burning incense. The pews were filled with people, all of them facing the altar, their heads bowed in silence. It took a moment for Emily and Marcus to realize that the congregation was dressed unusually. The women wore long, flowing black dresses that looked more like something from a different century, and the men were draped in dark robes with hoods pulled over their heads. The chanting they'd heard from outside had stopped the moment they entered, and now, every head in the church was turned to look at them. The silence was deafening. Emily's heart raced as she felt the weight of dozens of eyes on them. The people in the pews stared with cold, unblinking expressions, their faces partially obscured by the shadows cast by the flickering candlelight. The room felt wrong, the atmosphere thick with an unsettling tension. It was as if they had walked into a place they didn't belong, a place they weren't supposed to see. Before they could decide whether to leave or stay, a figure appeared from the back of the church, stepping onto the altar. He was tall, dressed in the same dark robes as the others, but his face was hidden behind an ornate, unsettling mask, something that looked like a cross between a bishop's headdress and a skull. The masked leader pointed directly at them, his voice a low growl that cut through the silence. The command was clear: they were not welcome. Emily grabbed Marcus's arm, her pulse quickening. Without a word, they turned and hurried out of the church, the door slamming shut behind them as if sealing them off from the strange world they had just glimpsed. But as they made their way back to their car, they couldn't shake the feeling that the congregation was still watching. Emily's hands shook as she fumbled for the car keys, the eerie silence from the church still ringing in her ears. Marcus, equally rattled, kept glancing back toward the building, half expecting someone, or something, to come after them. The tension from inside hadn't left, it felt like they were being watched, even as they hurried to the safety of their car. Finally, Emily managed to unlock the doors, and they both jumped in, slamming them shut. Marcus turned the ignition, the engine sputtering to life. Without saying a word, they drove down the dirt road, kicking up dust behind them. The church faded into the distance, but the feeling of unease lingered in the car. As they sped down the empty rural road, Marcus glanced at Emily. "That was wrong," he muttered, his voice barely audible over the hum of the engine. Emily nodded, her eyes fixed straight ahead, her thoughts racing. The way the people in the church had stared at them, their blank, cold expressions, felt burned into her mind. Just as they were beginning to calm down, a pair of headlights appeared in the rearview mirror. A van, one of the same vehicles that had been parked outside the church. The headlights were distant at first, but the van quickly gained on them, speeding down the narrow road. Marcus's grip on the steering wheel tightened. "Is that the same van from the church?" Emily's pulse quickened as she glanced back. The van was unmistakable, old, white, with patches of rust on the sides. And it was following them, getting closer with each passing second. "Just drive faster," Emily urged, her voice tight with fear. Marcus pressed his foot harder on the gas, the car picking up speed as they swerved around a curve. But the van matched their speed, staying just a few car lengths behind. The road ahead stretched out into the night, the empty fields on either side offering no escape. The headlights from the van flooded their car, casting long shadows inside the vehicle. Emily's heart raced as she looked back again, her mind reeling with questions. Why were they being followed? What did these people want? As they rounded another bend, the van surged forward, closing the gap between them. Marcus's knuckles were white on the steering wheel as he pushed the car to its limits. "We can't outrun them," he muttered through clenched teeth. The road ahead was narrow, with no signs of other vehicles or houses, nothing but the dark, empty countryside. Emily's breath came in short, panicked bursts as the van inched closer. It was now so close that she could see the outline of a figure behind the wheel, though the details were obscured by the darkness. "We need to get to a main road," Marcus said, his voice strained. "There has to be a town or something nearby. We can't keep running like this." Emily nodded, her eyes darting between the road ahead and the van behind them. Every second felt like an eternity, the sense of danger pressing down on them like a physical weight. Suddenly, the road widened, and up ahead, a faint glow of streetlights came into view, a small town in the distance. Relief washed over them, but the van was still close, its headlights glaring in the rearview mirror. They needed to find help, fast. The dim lights of the small town flickered in the distance, offering a glimmer of hope as Marcus and Emily sped toward safety. The van, though still following them, seemed to hang back, its headlights no longer bearing down on them. Marcus's knuckles were white as he gripped the steering wheel, his eyes darting between the road ahead and the rearview mirror. "We need to find help." "A police station, anything," Emily said, her voice shaky but filled with urgency. She scanned the darkened streets as they entered the town, hoping for some sign of security. The town was small and quiet, with only a few dim streetlights casting long shadows across the empty sidewalks. It felt deserted. Marcus slowed the car as they approached an intersection, squinting at the buildings. There, he pointed toward a squat, one-story structure with a glowing sign that read Sheriff's Office. Relief washed over them as they pulled into the gravel parking lot, the crunch of tires on dirt the only sound in the still night. The van, which had been trailing them relentlessly for miles, came to a stop a few blocks behind, its headlights disappearing as it parked in the shadows of a narrow alley. Marcus and Emily exchanged uneasy glances. It felt like whoever was in the van didn't want to be seen near the police station. Without wasting a second, they rushed toward the sheriff's office, pushing open the door. The air inside was cool and smelled faintly of old coffee and paper. Behind the counter sat a lone sheriff's deputy, an older man with graying hair and a bored expression, which quickly shifted to concern when he saw the look of panic on their faces. "What's going on?" he asked, rising from his seat. His voice was calm, but his eyes flickered with curiosity. Emily spoke first, her words tumbling out in a rush. "We were driving through the countryside, and we stopped at this old church. Something was wrong with the people there. They started staring at us, and this van has been following us ever since. We don't feel safe." The deputy frowned, listening carefully. "A van? How long has it been following you?" "Since we left the church," Marcus answered, glancing nervously over his shoulder, as if expecting the van to appear any second. "We were driving for miles, and they wouldn't stop." The deputy grabbed his hat and motioned for them to follow him outside. "Let's take a look," he said, his voice steady but serious. They stepped outside into the cool night air, the small town eerily quiet around them. Emily's pulse raced as she scanned the street, half expecting the van to come roaring around the corner. But the road was empty, save for their own car parked nearby. "It was right behind us," Marcus muttered, confused. "It's gone." The deputy squinted down the dark road, his gaze sharp. "Sounds like you stumbled into something you shouldn't have," he said quietly. "That church, we've heard stories. People around here avoid it for a reason." Emily felt a chill run down her spine. "What kind of stories?" The deputy's face was grim. "Let's just say it's best you don't go back there. Those people don't take kindly to outsiders." Marcus and Emily exchanged a worried glance. Whatever was happening, it was far from over. The sheriff's words lingered in the air, casting a shadow over the small town's quiet streets. Emily's mind raced as she tried to piece everything together. The eerie church, the strange people, the van that had chased them, none of it made sense, yet the fear gnawing at her gut told her they were in serious danger. The sheriff, noticing their unease, led them back inside the station. "You're safe here," he assured them, though his tone was cautious. "Why don't you stay put for a bit? I'll keep an eye out in case that van shows up again." Emily and Marcus exchanged anxious glances but nodded in agreement. For the first time since they'd left the church, they felt a small sliver of safety. The sheriff seemed competent, and the small, dimly lit station was better than being out on the open road. As they sat in the small waiting area, time seemed to crawl. The ticking of the clock on the wall was the only sound breaking the silence. Emily couldn't stop herself from glancing out the window every few minutes, her nerves on edge. Marcus sat with his head in his hands, trying to steady his breathing. The reality of what had happened was sinking in, and neither of them could shake the feeling that something terrible was looming. Suddenly, the crackle of the sheriff's radio cut through the silence. He picked it up quickly, his brow furrowing. "Got a report of a suspicious van parked near the outskirts of town," the voice on the other end said. "Driver's just sitting there, hasn't moved in a while." Emily's heart sank. "It's them," she whispered, her pulse quickening. The sheriff's expression darkened. "Stay here," he ordered, heading for the door. "Lock the door behind me, and don't open it for anyone but me." Marcus and Emily did as they were told, locking the door as soon as the sheriff left. The fear that had briefly subsided came flooding back. They were alone now, and even though they were in the safety of the station, the creeping dread of the unknown still loomed large. Emily could barely catch her breath, the tension gnawing at her insides. Minutes passed in silence, the ticking clock growing louder with each passing second. Then, from outside, the faint sound of an engine rumbled in the distance. Emily rushed to the window, her heart pounding in her chest. The van was back. It rolled slowly down the street, its headlights off, creeping toward the station like a predator stalking its prey. Emily's blood turned to ice as she watched, frozen in place. The van came to a stop just outside the building, its driver hidden behind the darkened windows. For a long moment, nothing happened. It just sat there, watching them. Then, the door opened. Marcus grabbed Emily's arm, pulling her away from the window. The two of them backed away, fear tightening its grip around their throats. Whatever was happening, it wasn't over yet. A dark secret in the church. Sam was 8 years old when he first encountered the man at the church. It was a typical Sunday morning, the sun streaming through the stained glass windows, casting colorful patterns on the pews. He sat quietly beside his mother, half listening to the priest's sermon, his mind drifting to the upcoming scout event he was excited about. The church was filled with familiar faces, the same people who gathered each week for the service. But that day, there was someone new. Toward the back of the church, standing alone near the entrance, was a man Sam had never seen before. He wore a long, dark coat, despite the warmth of the day, and his hair was unkempt. What caught Sam's attention wasn't his appearance, but the way the man stared directly at him, his eyes unblinking, his expression unreadable. At first, Sam tried to ignore it. He was used to strangers in church, people passing through or visiting, but this man was different. His gaze never left Sam, and after a few minutes, something even stranger happened. The man began to contort his face into bizarre expressions, pulling at his skin and sticking out his tongue in a way that was both mocking and unsettling. Sam glanced at his mother, but she was focused on the sermon, unaware of what was happening. He felt a knot tighten in his stomach, unsure of what to do. He looked back at the man, who was now smiling, an eerie, twisted grin that made Sam's skin crawl. It was as if the man was daring him to react. The service seemed to drag on forever, and Sam kept his eyes on the floor, avoiding the man's gaze. But the feeling of being watched didn't go away. Every now and then, he'd sneak a quick glance, only to find the man still staring, still smiling. When the service finally ended, Sam hurried out of the church with his mother, keeping close to her side. He didn't mention the man at first, unsure if it was worth bringing up. But as they walked home, the image of the man's twisted face stayed with him, gnawing at his mind. Something about the encounter felt wrong, like a bad dream he couldn't shake. Over the next few days, Sam tried to forget about the man. He focused on school and the upcoming scout event, a treasure hunt that the troop was organizing in the local park. It was supposed to be a fun day with his friends, a break from the routine of church and school. But the man wasn't finished with him yet. The day of the scout event arrived, and Sam's excitement helped push the memory of the strange man to the back of his mind. The park was bustling with energy, kids running around, laughing and preparing for the treasure hunt. Sam was eager to join his friends, their scout leader handing out maps and giving instructions on where to search for the hidden treasures scattered across the park. It felt like the perfect escape from the unease that had been gnawing at him since that eerie Sunday. The hunt began, and Sam was deep in the woods with two of his closest friends, following the trail marked on their map. The trees provided a cool canopy of shade, and the sound of birds chirping overhead gave the day a peaceful backdrop. For the first time in days, Sam felt relaxed, the strange man from the church now a distant memory. But as they ventured further from the main group, Sam began to sense something off. The woods had grown quieter, and there was a stillness in the air that made him pause. He didn't want to alarm his friends, so he kept walking, his eyes scanning the trail for any signs of treasure. They were getting close to a spot marked on the map, just beyond a small clearing. As they stepped into the clearing, Sam froze. There, standing just beyond the edge of the trees, was the man from the church. His long, dark coat seemed out of place in the warmth of the day, and his greasy hair hung in his face. The man smiled when he saw Sam, the same twisted grin he had flashed in the church. Panic shot through Sam's body. His friends hadn't noticed the man yet, too focused on the map, but Sam couldn't move. The man beckoned him forward, his smile widening. Then, in a voice barely above a whisper, he called out to Sam. "I've got something for you. Sweet treats, just for you." Sam's heart raced. He wanted to yell, to run, but his feet were rooted to the spot. The man's voice was low, almost hypnotic, and for a moment, Sam felt like he was being pulled toward him. But then, with a burst of adrenaline, Sam snapped out of the trance. He grabbed his friends by the arms and, without explaining, turned and ran back toward the main group. His friends stumbled after him, confused by his sudden panic but following his lead without question. Sam didn't stop running until they reached the scout leader, breathless and trembling. His mind was racing, but all he could think about was how close the man had been, how real the danger felt. The man had followed him from the church. And this time, he had tried to lure him away. Sam's heart pounded in his chest as he tried to catch his breath. His friends were confused, asking him why he had run, but Sam couldn't speak just yet. His mind was racing, replaying the moment in the clearing, the sight of the man standing there, smiling, and trying to lure him with the promise of sweets. The scout leader, Mr. Henson, approached, noticing Sam's distress. "Are you okay? What happened out there?" His voice was calm but filled with concern. Sam looked up at him, his hands still shaking, and tried to explain. "There was a man, the same man from church, he was there in the woods," Sam stammered, his voice trembling. His friends exchanged puzzled glances, unsure of what to make of Sam's claim, but they could see the fear in his eyes. Mr. Henson's expression shifted from concern to alarm. He knelt down to Sam's level, his tone more serious now. "A man? Where did you see him?" Sam pointed back toward the clearing, his finger shaking. "He was just there, at the edge of the trees. He told me he had sweets, but it's the same man from the church. I don't know how, but he's following me." Mr. Henson's face hardened. He didn't doubt Sam's story, especially given how shaken the boy was. "Stay here with the others," he said, standing up and motioning for another adult leader to keep an eye on the group. "I'm going to take a look." As Mr. Henson headed toward the clearing, Sam's thoughts spiraled. What was that man doing here? How had he found Sam at the park? And more importantly, what did he want? The feeling of being watched, of being followed, was overwhelming, and Sam couldn't shake the image of the man's grin from his mind. Minutes later, Mr. Henson returned, his face grim. "There's no one there now," he said, though his tone didn't carry much reassurance. "But I believe you, Sam. We'll report this to the authorities and make sure everyone stays together for the rest of the day. No one's going off alone." Sam nodded, but the fear still clung to him. The man was gone, but the danger felt more real than ever. After the event, Sam's mother arrived to pick him up, her usual warm smile fading as soon as she saw the worry etched on his face. "What's wrong?" she asked, her voice soft but filled with concern. Sam hesitated for a moment, unsure how to explain it all. But he had to tell her. He had to let her know what had happened at the church, and now at the park. So, as they walked to the car, he recounted everything, the strange man's grin during Mass, the way he'd appeared in the woods, and how he'd tried to lure him away. His mother's face turned pale, and her hands tightened on the steering wheel as she drove. "We'll go to the police," she said, her voice trembling with fear and anger. "You're not going near that church again." But Sam knew, deep down, that this wasn't over yet. The ride to the police station was tense. Sam sat in the back seat, staring out the window, his mind still racing. His mother didn't say much, her face set in a look of grim determination. Whatever this man was up to, she wasn't going to let it slide. They had to make sure he was stopped. At the station, Sam and his mother were quickly ushered in to speak with an officer. Sam recounted the entire story once again, how the man had stared at him in church, how he had made strange faces, and then how he had reappeared during the treasure hunt, trying to lure him with sweets. The officer listened carefully, taking notes, his expression growing more serious with every word. When Sam finished, the officer nodded and excused himself, leaving Sam and his mother in the small office. The minutes dragged on, each one filled with an oppressive silence. Sam's stomach churned with anxiety. He had done the right thing by telling the truth, but it didn't make the fear go away. The man was still out there, and the possibility of encountering him again made his skin crawl. Finally, the officer returned, a strange look on his face. He sat down across from them, his gaze shifting between Sam and his mother. "We've looked into this man you described," the officer said slowly, choosing his words carefully. "It seems he's not just some stranger. He works for the church, but there have been reports about him. Concerns, particularly regarding his interactions with younger members of the congregation." Sam felt a chill run down his spine. His mother's grip on his hand tightened. The officer continued, his tone grave. "We've received a few anonymous tips that this man has been involved in some questionable activities, including rumors of ritualistic practices with younger boys. We haven't been able to confirm anything yet, but your son's account adds to our growing concerns." Sam's mother's face paled, her voice barely above a whisper. "How long has this been going on?" The officer shook his head. "We don't know for sure. The church has been tight-lipped, and the man in question hasn't been seen in a few days. But we're actively investigating. We'll take every measure to ensure he's found and questioned. In the meantime, we advise you to stay away from the church." Sam's heart raced. The man who had followed him, who had tried to lure him away, wasn't just a random stranger. He had been hiding in plain sight, right within the church, and worse, he had a history of suspicious behavior. The weight of that realization sank in, filling Sam with a deep sense of unease. As they left the station, Sam couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't over. The man might be out of sight, but the fear lingered. His mother had promised to keep him safe, and the police were involved now, but Sam couldn't help but wonder how many other kids the man had tried to approach. The church, once a place of comfort, had become a source of fear. And though the man had vanished, Sam knew he wouldn't forget those twisted grins or the way the man had tried to pull him away. He had escaped, but the darkness of that encounter would stay with him for a long time. As the darkness closes in on our final tale, one thing's clear: these unsettling encounters remind us how close danger can truly be. From the stranger who stalked through the church to the man lurking in the woods, each story leaves its mark. But tell me, which one haunted you the most? Have you ever faced something so terrifying? Share your story with us in the comments, we'd love to hear it. And remember, every like and subscribe helps us grow this eerie community. Before you go, check out more terrifying videos here on the channel. Until next time, stay safe, if you can.